One of the most common questions I get asked is the following. Both Korea and Vietnam stopped using Chinese characters about 100 years ago. So why is Japanese still using kanji? And that is a great question, one that, despite me being Chinese, didn't really have the answer to. But you guys know I do a lot of deep dives on this channel, and I decided to deep dive the heck out of this one. And spoiler alert, I think I've got the answer for you guys, although it may not be one that you like so much. And before we get into all that, I just wanted to say I am still recovering from a cold. I'm a little bit better now, but my voice is still kind of wonky, so apologies in advance. And another thing I wanted to apologize for is that I am not a speaker of Vietnamese or Japanese, so my pronunciation of words in those languages may be a bit off. Well, on with the video. Chinese writing began at around 1200 BCE, aka a long time ago, during the Shang Dynasty. Legend has it that the king wanted answers to questions like, is it gonna rain? Is there gonna be a good harvest? Is the queen gonna have a baby boy or baby girl? And should I go to war? All very important questions. So what he did is that he had scholars write on animal bones or turtle shells the questions, and then they would burn the shells, and then the cracks on the shells would be considered answers, right? And then the writing on these shells were called oracle bone script or 甲骨文. And this is like the earliest known official records of Chinese characters. Eventually, the script became standardized around the Qin dynasty at around 221 BCE, and this script, called 篆书 or seal script, was unified across all the lands that China ruled. During the Han dynasty, it turned into 隶书 or clerical script, which straightened and simplified many characters. By the 3rd century, the writing system had largely settled into the writing that we know today, 楷书 or regular script. China's neighbors, Vietnam to the west, Korea to the northeast, and Japan to the east of Korea, all adopted Chinese characters after contact with the Middle Kingdom. Vietnam was first. At around 100 BCE, the Han Dynasty began its rule of Vietnam, which would last about 1,000 years. During this time, many elements of Chinese culture became deeply ingrained in Vietnamese culture. For example, the Confucian imperial testing system, and of course, Chinese characters. Chinese characters became the official script in Vietnam used for governmental and legal documents. The Vietnamese called Chinese characters Zhu Han. Korea followed. Diplomatic relations with China began around the 4th century during the time of the Baekje and Goguryeo periods. Like the Vietnamese, Koreans adopted Chinese characters for law, government, and scholarship. The Koreans called Chinese characters hanja. Through the Korean kingdom of Baekje, Chinese characters were introduced to Japan at around the 5th to 6th centuries, mostly through Chinese and Korean migrants. And the Japanese called Chinese characters Kanji. One thing that all 3 countries had in common was a lack of a standardized and unified writing system. Chinese characters offered a very practical solution. They could be used to write governmental documents, as well as Buddhist and Confucian texts, which were highly influential across the region. So I had someone comment in a previous video, since I already speak Chinese and Korean, if I just learned Japanese, I would have the triple crown of East Asian languages. And now that I've done the research on this video, I am more interested in Japanese than ever. And luckily, I have the perfect learning platform to help me. italki. italki is an online language learning platform where you're connected with over 30,000 native-speaking teachers worldwide. There are over 150 languages offered, and with the user-friendly interface, it's easy to find your perfect teacher. You can filter teachers based on your level, your needs, and your interests. You can also find those that speak your native language, which is so helpful when you're a beginner trying to learn a brand new language. Now, that all sounds great, but what's the price? And that's where italki really shines. All lessons are pay per lesson. No more subscription regret.
メアリーさんは高校生ですか？
いいえ、高校生じゃありません。大学生です。
잘하셨네요. 이렇게 하면 돼요. 너무 발음도 좋고
Oh,
괜찮아요.
I just found out that italki added some really cool AI features called italki Plus to help you keep learning in between lessons. It can actually generate quizzes based on what you talked about in class. So thank you for watching. For the first 50 people who use my code Julesy11, you can buy $10 and get $5 for free on your first lesson. So click the link in the description and get started on your language learning journey. And now, back to the video. When these Chinese words were imported all those hundreds of years ago, the characters maintained their visual, logographic forms, but the pronunciations were adapted to match the phonetic patterns of each language. Vietnamese and Korean were particularly compatible with Middle Chinese. Both languages were tonal and they had many consonant endings, just like Middle Chinese. And so this helped them maintain the monosyllabic forms in both Vietnamese and Korean. For example, the character 学, which means study in Chinese, was pronounced closer to gok in Middle Chinese. And this turned into gok in Vietnamese and hak in Korean. Japanese, however, didn't have any consonant endings other than n, and that's why many monosyllabic characters in Chinese turn into multisyllabic words in Japanese. So in Japanese, going off the previous example, gok turned into gaku. So far, we've seen that Chinese characters were mainly used to write out Chinese loanwords in these three languages. But eventually, native scripts started to appear. Japanese was the first of the three countries to develop a native writing system at around the 8th to 9th centuries. Essentially, the Japanese borrowed the sounds of Chinese characters to represent Japanese moire. And moire is kind of like a syllable, but it's quite unique to Japanese phonology. So if you're interested in that, ask me in the comments. One of these systems, hiragana, is a cursive-looking syllabary used to write out Japanese grammar and function words. So essentially, the Japanese took a Chinese character with a specific sound and then simplified that form to make it look more kind of cursive-y, and that became the representation of that sound in Japanese. Katakana, on the other hand, did not simplify entire Chinese characters. It usually took the radical of a character and then simplified that to mean a sound associated with that character. So for example, I turned into I in katakana. And kanji were used alongside hiragana and katakana, which are collectively called kana. Vietnam was next to come up with a native writing system for Vietnamese in the 13th century called Junom. And like the Japanese, the Vietnamese used parts of Chinese characters to try to represent native sounds and words. However, instead of simplifying characters to make syllabaries, Vietnamese scholars decided to invent entirely new characters. They created new characters by combining a semantic radical, which gives the meaning, and a phonetic component, which gives the sound. For example, the Vietnamese word ba, which means three, is written like this, made up of a semantic radical, san, meaning three in Chinese, and a phonetic radical, ba, and that is the pronunciation portion because it's pronounced ba in Chinese. For context, this is how the vast majority of Chinese characters themselves were formed. About 80 to 90% of all Chinese characters are semantic phonetic compounds. Although Junom was very logically designed, it required a high degree of understanding of classical Chinese. So only those already fluent in Chinese could learn and use it. And moreover, many characters were created ad hoc for whenever a writer needed to use them. So they would just end up looking different depending on whoever was writing the character. And all these factors led to Junom not being widely adopted in Vietnam. And last but not least, Korean. I made a video about this recently, so you can just go watch that when you have time. But in the 15th century, King Sejong and a team of scholars created a brand new writing script called Hangul, and it originally was made to write out Chinese Korean words, or hanja, as well as native Korean words. Unlike the Japanese and Vietnamese solutions, which assign a unique symbol to each syllable, Hangul has a distinct form for each consonant and vowel. In this way, it's kind of similar to the Latin script. Just memorize 20 or some odd symbols and you can pretty much read the entire script. And it's no secret that I love Hangul, so for the sake of this video, we're just gonna move right on. So just as a summary, Japan has been using kanji, hiragana, and katakana, all three in pretty much all texts. They use them, within the same context, and it's been like that for hundreds of years. In Vietnam, because Junom was very difficult to learn, it didn't really catch on. And in the 17th century, Portuguese Jesuit missionaries in Vietnam created a Latin-based script. And I'm not going to try to pronounce this, but that's what it's called. And in the 19th century, the French colonized Vietnam, and to help out with their colonizing, they promoted the Latin script, which they could read. And this gradually replaced Chu Han and Chu Nom, and now Vietnamese is written exclusively in the Latin alphabet. Korea, like Vietnam, also no longer used Chinese characters, and Hangul, much like the Latin alphabet, took quite a while to gain widespread acceptance, but by the late 1800s, Hangul had become the dominant script, and nowadays, Chinese writing is pretty much not used in Korea at all. Which brings us to the question that you've been wanting an answer to since the beginning of this video. I know. Why is it that Japanese still uses Chinese characters while Korean and Vietnamese clearly don't? And I think if you ask different people, you're going to get slightly different answers. But luckily for you, I've done the hard work. And I've classified them into two major camps. The first being linguistic or practical, and the second being cultural and political. And you can listen to all the reasons and make an informed decision for yourself. Let's start with the linguistic and practical reasons. According to experts, there are three major reasons why Japanese still uses kanji. First, Japanese has a rather small syllabary, and I'm not just talking about compared to English. I'm talking about compared to Vietnamese and Korean. By most estimates, Japanese has about 107 unique syllables, give or take, and that can make reading everything in kana a little bit confusing. For example, hashi can mean bridge, chopsticks, or edge. And you can usually figure out what it means based on the context, but that slows down reading and it takes extra effort. Second, a single Chinese character is often 2 to 3 syllables in Japanese, which would take 2 to 3 kana letters. So retaining the kanji would save space and make reading more efficient. For example, Nihongo, which means Japanese, in Chinese characters is only 3 syllables, but in kana it would be 5. Finally, Japanese doesn't use spaces in its writing. Imagine English being written like this. It's readable, but definitely annoying. Kanji helps break up the text, making it easier to see which ones are nouns, which is usually kanji, which ones are grammatical markers, hiragana, and which are words from other languages, katakana. So you can clearly see which ones are the Chinese characters, and they kind of anchor, different important words in the sentence. This system, made up of 3 different scripts, may seem overly complicated to non-Japanese speakers, but to Japanese people, it just makes a lot of sense. And even me, I'm not Japanese, and to me, this makes a lot of sense. But here's the question. Wouldn't this same logic also apply to Vietnamese and Korean? After all, not just in Japanese, about 50 to 70% of all words in Vietnamese and Korean are of Chinese origin as well. So wouldn't having the Chinese characters maintained in these languages also speed up the reading, making it more precise and concise? Actually, like the Japanese, Koreans also used a mixed hanja, Hangul writing system for quite a number of years. A mixed Hanja Hangul system became more and more prevalent starting in the 18th century, and this practice heightened during the early 20th century, which is the time period when Korea was colonized by Japan, and Japan was using, the Kanji kind of system. So this kind of like amped up the amount of Hanja used in Korean writing. So Korean does have a lot more syllables than Japanese. Depending on your analysis, anywhere from 2,000 to 2,800 unique syllables are available in Korean. But like Japanese, Sino-Korean words also create a lot of homophones. For example, the Korean syllable su can represent any number of Chinese characters. Shu, number, shou, hand. Xiu, embroidery, shou, head. Xiu, superior. Shou, life. Shou, receive. Qiu, imprison. Shui, water. So all of these words are frequently used in modern Korean, and being a Chinese person living in Korea, I often find myself doing linguistic forensics, trying to figure out which character a certain syllable is referring to. That is, if it's a Chinese loanword at all. Sometimes it's a native Korean word, and sometimes it's an English loanword. And in those cases, I'm like wishing that Korea had its own version of katakana. It would make things a lot more easier for me. So while I think the mixed Hangul Hanja system works really well, and I think it would be great if we still had it, in addition to a Korean katakana, please. I think most native Korean speakers don't really see an issue with not using Chinese characters. And, like Chinese characters, Korean words are usually di or trisyllabic nowadays, so there isn't really a huge amount of ambiguity, although I think that it would help to have Hanja. So Vietnamese, the situation is quite different. Modern Vietnamese has 6 tones. Like I mentioned, in Korean, modern Korean, and Japanese, there are no tones. So that just kind of like totally ups the amount of syllables that we can have in Vietnamese. Not only that, Vietnamese has more vowels than both Korean and Japanese. Vietnamese has anywhere from 11 to 14 monophthongs, depending on your interpretation, while Korean has 8 and Japanese has 5. And Vietnamese also has a large number of diphthongs and triphthongs, whereas Korean and Japanese don't have any triphthongs. And so adding all this together, this takes the total amount of syllables possible in the Vietnamese syllabary to anywhere from 4,500 to 4,800 syllables. And that is a lot more than both Korean and Japanese. I mean, as a reminder, Japanese syllables cap at around 107. So since Vietnamese has so many more syllables that are differentiatable, there are a lot fewer homophones when they are dealing with Sino-Vietnamese loanwords as compared to Korean or Japanese. So just as a summary, because that was a lot, the Japanese phonology and writing system makes it the most dependent on having Chinese characters being there, whereas Korean is slightly less dependent on Chinese characters, but the system would still arguably be more efficient with characters. And Vietnamese, having the biggest syllabary of the 3, is the least dependent on Chinese characters, although knowing the characters behind Vietnamese words would still help you understand the language better, in my opinion. And finally, we get to the cultural and the political reasons. And this is, the doozy. Just have to prepare you guys for this part. So many Japanese argue that Chinese characters are a key part of their culture and their history, and that knowing characters is a sign of education, right? And I'm not going to argue with that. I think that's totally true. But out of the 3 countries we've discussed in this video so far, I think Japan is the least influenced by China, and by extension, by Chinese characters. As I mentioned before, both Korea and Vietnam directly border China, and therefore had a lot more cultural connections, cultural exchange, and were more influenced by Chinese culture in general. I mean, Vietnam, for example, was ruled by China for about 1,000 years, and Korea too had a bit of a tributary system going on with China. And so both countries they adopted the very intense Confucian imperial testing system, which both countries used for about 1,000 years. Japan, by contrast, never adopted this merit-based imperial testing system. Confucianism was influential, but it was never state ideology like it was in Korea and Vietnam. Instead, Japan borrowed Chinese characters and other elements of Chinese culture to complement its own culture and its own government, not to replace or dominate it. This distinction really gets to the heart of the matter. Because Japan always maintained its cultural and political independence, Kanji never got the baggage associated with it like it did in Vietnam and Korea. For the Japanese, kanji were simply just a useful tool to convey information with. In contrast, Chinese characters and culture were essentially imposed upon the Vietnamese and the Koreans. And fast forward to the late 19th century, both countries once again were dominated by foreign countries. Vietnam by France, Korea by Japan. Adopting an alphabetic, non-Chinese script, one that was easy to learn and, in Korea's case, native to its culture, became a form of resistance. During the rapid modernization of the 20th century, having an alphabetic script was seen as the practical way to unify a nation and propel it towards a better future. In the end, nationalism and a desire for independence played key roles in both Korea and Vietnam, dropping Chinese characters altogether. So that is probably like one of the longest videos I've recorded to date. And I put a lot of heart and soul into this video, guys. I know as a Chinese person, some people may see that my videos are biased towards China. And, I do have some kind of, soft spot for China, obviously, as I am a Chinese person, but my videos, I try to keep them as neutral as possible. And so I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys learned a lot because I sure did doing the research. This was a tough video to research, but I hope I did it justice. And I will see you in my next video. Bye.